with us, and welcome to Tips for Your Employee Handbook. Today sponsored by the Workforce Development Board of Ventura County. My name is Anna Manzano. I'm the digital media and event strategist here at the California Employers Association. Before we get into today's training, just a couple details to go over with you. So as you see, your audio is muted for today's presentation, but we really encourage you to engage during today's training. If you have any questions about the content, you can put those into the Q&A box at any time. Because we have one trainer today, you can also put those into the chat box, and I will make sure that Astrid sees those questions and we address them as we go if possible. Handouts for this training were sent out in yesterday's reminder email. However, I know we had a couple of last minute registrations, so I'm going to drop that PDF into the chat box shortly. So once you see that icon pop up, you can click on it and it should download locally to your drive. If you have any issues accessing that PDF, you can just ping me in the chat and I'll be happy to help you. Last but not least, we do have a survey. So because your feedback is incredibly important to us, we have a very quick survey. It's 5 questions. It takes generally less than a minute to complete. But the feedback that you share with us in that 1 minute, we share with our partners over at Ventura County, and collectively we make sure that we are meeting and hopefully exceeding those expectations. So you'll see a slide pop up with the QR code. You'll also see a window pop up once you click out of Zoom with an option to opt into that survey. So we really hope that you'll help us out at the end. And as I mentioned, today is sponsored by our partners over at Ventura County. Today, we are so grateful to have Rebecca Ochoa, who is one of their business solution specialists, to share more about the resources available to employers like yourself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this informative webinar. As we go into the new year, we know that some tips on the employee handbook are questions that you might have, and this is sponsored by CEA through the Workforce Development Board, so super thankful for all of you that have joined. We encourage you to continue using the hotline for employers. As you can see on the screen, this is a complimentary service to employers to ask the questions. It's at no cost. And we have professionals behind answering every question. So it provided guidance on hiring and firing process, question on paid leave laws, and all of these amazing topics that you guys have. Super thankful for that. If you guys have any other questions, we have multiple services for our employers within Ventura County. If you are out of the county, we will refer to your nearest Workforce Development Board to assist you with.
Oh, I think she got frozen there.
So I think Rebecca got frozen, but we will move on. And if there's anything else to share, then we'll make sure we save a few moments at the end to wrap up. But I do want to thank, again, Ventura County for sponsoring today, Rebecca, Cynthia, the other Rebecca, Colleen, and their entire team behind the scenes for bringing you all here today and providing so many resources to employers like yourself. So thank you again, Ventura County, for sponsoring today. And now I'd like to introduce our trainer today. We have Astrid Servin, one of our HR directors. If you have called into that HR hotline, maybe you've had the pleasure of working with her, and she has a full hour of content for us. So Astrid, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Anna and Rebecca. Sorry we lost you, Rebecca, but like Anna said, we can save some time at the end if needed, if you have additional items to share. But please call in. I do see some familiar names there, so I do think I've talked to some of you out in Ventura County. Love going to Ventura County too, so if you ever need any visits out there in the HR world, please shout out and let us know, and we can be there for you. One of the benefits you have, part of the Ventura County partnership with CEA, is you do get a discount for the handbook, and we're going to be talking about the handbook today. So just know that you do get 10% off our handbook template, which if you're not a member is only $349, and if you are a member, it's $249. So you do get that 10% off of that. So please, again, call into the 800 number there that you're seeing so that you can ask about that as well. So a little bit about CEA for those of you who may not know our company. We partner with the workforce development at Ventura County, but we are an HR consulting company, and we like to say we pride ourselves with providing California employers with peace of mind through HR compliance solutions. So we do it all with training such as these. We go on site and do trainings. We offer offer support in any way you can think of when it comes to employment and the employment cycle from beginning to end for California employers. So we'll answer your questions. We can do audits. We can do handbooks again. We provide fact sheets and guidelines because there are so many things to remember when it comes to California law. We stay on top of it for you. So even if you feel like you need a little bit more support, check us out at employers.org and you can see what membership is like. You get a little bit more support when you have membership through us. But if not, you should at least subscribe to our blog. That's free, and you can stay on top of California law that way as well, because we do offer quite a bit of alerts to our non-members and our members when there's a law change. So, and there will be quite a few law changes, one of which I will talk about today coming up for 2025. What we are not is a law firm. We are not a law firm, so this presentation should not be relied upon as legal advice. We want you to consult your own attorney when anything of legal significance comes up to you and your company. We want to make sure that that conversation is protected. We want to make sure that your conversation is privileged, it's confidential, and that they're guiding you in a legal manner. So when that comes up, please contact an attorney. If you don't have one, we have resources for you. We have partners that we partner with if you need that assistance. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about the best essential things to have in your employee California compliant handbook. So we're going to talk about the benefits and the risks, because there are both when it comes to writing things down in writing. As you know, in California, there's a benefit to writing things down, but there could also be a risk. So we want to make sure you do it right. We're going to talk about the essential provisions, what you should have, the minimum stuff that you should have. What are the best practices? What are we highly going to recommend that you include, and the reasons why? We're going to talk about reviewing and editing that handbook, especially as you end the year. This is a great time to take this webinar because you can think about what we need to take out, what we need to remove, and what we need to add for the new year. And there are some law changes, so we want to make sure we update our handbooks every year. And so that annual checkup is going to be essential as well. So let's get into it and discuss some of those things. And as Anna mentioned, please, the chat is open. If you have questions, even if it's sort of related to the handbook, but you have a question because something triggered you to think about it, ask it in the chat. If I have time, I will go ahead and keep my eyes peeled to the chat and make sure to answer anything in there. So let's talk about the benefits of an employee handbook. I think the number one benefit that you can have is really setting that positive tone for your company, making sure that the employees that are working for you know that this is a company that thought enough to have a handbook, to list the missions and the values in that handbook. And that really sets that positive tone for how you're going to communicate with your team. It's showing quite a bit of information on there about how you feel about your team. It's also going to include a confirmation of at-will employment, which in California is important. We're an at-will state, but it's not enough to just be an at-will state. You want to have that disclaimer in your company handbook, and we'll talk about what that at-will disclaimer means in a future slide. But you want to have that confirmation on your handbook because that's going to benefit you should there be any kind of dispute in the future with an employee. You're going to have that at-will disclaimer protecting you. It's going to explain policies and expectations for your employees. So how does an employee know what is a violation of policy if we have none? So we want to make sure this is a good place to put all those policies and what the expectations are. It's going to maintain uniformity and consistency, meaning that it's not just one department that has to follow the rules, it's the whole company. And sometimes this is where it can be a setback, is we're not consistent. And maybe this department gets away with not following the attendance policy, but the other department has to follow it. So you want to make sure that we have that consistency in order for it to be a benefit to your handbook. Defense to harassment claims. This is another key area because California requires employers to have disclaimers of harassment-free workplaces to list out the policies. So if there is, which those are the mega big lawsuits of a harassment nature, we're going to have that defense in our handbook saying that we were a harassment-free environment. And then, of course, union avoidance. Unions are huge in California, and they're probably getting a little bit of traction, I think, in some industries. So you want to have a handbook that explains everything to an employee to hopefully avoid any kind of union or organization in your company. So what to avoid? Not following the handbook. If you have a handbook, great, but know the handbook, because if you're not going to follow the policies and the rules surrounding that handbook, it's not going to work. You're going to have an inconsistent work environment in which you can get in trouble for not applying it consistently. And then not reviewing it. So if you're not reviewing this handbook annually or maybe even semi-annually as laws change, then your handbook is outdated and you're going to be subject to the terms of that policy, which may be out of compliance. So you want to make sure you're reviewing it, you're updating it. We want to avoid downloading just a random version on the internet, which some people do. They take a download from there, and some of that is like a very legally worded document that nobody's going to read. It has all this legal jargon in it, and we want to make sure that, our employees actually are reading the handbook. So we want to avoid any kind of downloading a random version, especially because more than likely it's not going to be a California compliant handbook. Even if you get a California compliant handbook, is it actually updated, current? Is it current? So we don't want to do that. Borrowing one is a bad idea as well. We don't want to, different industries have different wage orders. We don't want to borrow someone else's handbook, and we don't want to, again, just download a random one, or even if you inherited one, because sometimes that happens. We inherit a handbook that was given to us from years ago. I worked with businesses and they're like, well, this is the handbook that came when we bought the practice, but that might not work. It might be antiquated policies. They might have not been compliant, which is the case many times. So let's avoid those things to create less risk for your environment. So when it comes to creating your handbook, this is where you really need to take time to assess what do we do right now. We want to make sure that it's accurately reflecting the business practices that we have, the culture that we currently have. Is it an actual true reflection of your work environment? So assess your current policies. You may find that new policies are required and the old ones are no longer valid. We have policies and handbooks that have been there for 10, 20 years, and that's just not the way we do things anymore. Or maybe they are a little bit more of a strict policy and our work environment has changed. Maybe the type of workforce that we have has changed. So it's going to require you to assess what works and what doesn't work anymore. And then begin the drafting process. What kind of tone do we want for our handbook? The ideal handbook has policies that are carefully and clearly worded. They're going to be an accurate reflection of your policy, and they're consistent and applicable with legal requirements. A lot of times we have policies we think are nice and we have good intentions, but they're not compliant. So we want to be careful with that. We want to make sure that it's understood by the audience. Again, that legal jargon, because a lot of times we get these handbooks and lawyers write it, and I love lawyers sometimes, but they do use that hereto, forto language that many times we're not even sure what it's saying, and our employees are probably not going to be interested in hearing a handbook that's written that way. So we don't want a snooze fest when it comes to a handbook. Write it, you can be creative, you can be upbeat, you can be different ways in the tone to that handbook. But the most important thing is we want to make sure it's understood and that employees are reading it. Okay, so sometimes employers call a handbook a policy manual, but there is a difference. A handbook is general applicable policies. We're going to have all our policies that apply there. It's going to be abbreviated coverage of benefits. It's for everyone in the company. It's not just going to be including the higher executives or just the hourly employees. It's going to include everyone in your workplace. So this handbook applies to all. Where a policy manual is more of a department policy manual. They're procedures. This is how we do things. There's a machine we use and this is the procedures that we use for it. Or there is a system in place and this is what we do. And policy manuals tend to be more detailed because we're going into how things operate, the step-by-step of how things operate. And that's usually for managers and supervisors. They're the ones kind of keeping reading that policy manual. It changes often, possibly. Where a handbook, we have it pretty set in stone unless there's a law change. So those are the differences. Make sure we get the language right on what we call it, and that we are differentiating between a handbook and a policy. We don't want to be all inclusive in including procedures in a handbook. It's just not, again, that snooze fest. We're going to keep them separated. So let's talk about handbook basics, avoiding confusion, what's required in a handbook, best practices, other options to consider as well. Let's dive into this next section. So your handbook should be able to answer some of these questions. Let me know if you think these sound familiar. You can't change my job description. I was hired with this job description. You can't change it. What about, do we have to give you 2 weeks notice? I don't want to. I just want tomorrow to be my last day. If my coworker makes me uncomfortable, what do I do? Is there a procedure for that? Is there a policy for that? My friend who is a lawyer says you have to give me that time off and you have to pay me. I literally got that call yesterday from a member who said their employee said that to them. Their friend told them that they needed to pay them for this specific day because it was a holiday party and they were asked to go to it. And so you have to pay me for this holiday party. And do you? I asked the member, I don't know, do you? So we can talk about that. Do I get paid for the holiday? If I work the holiday, do I get paid? If I don't work for the holiday, do I get paid? Is there a difference? How much vacation do I get each year? And am I accruing that vacation? Am I getting that vacation when I've reached a year, or am I getting it all at once? How does vacation work? What if I don't want to take my breaks? I just want to skip my breaks and just power through. Is that okay? So these are the kinds of questions that I'm sure management get, many, many more. We get them into the hotline a lot too. Your handbook should be able to answer all of these questions. And if employees look in their handbook, they'll get their answer. But if your handbook is, again, antiquated, maybe not updated, maybe the current policy isn't on there, you're going to have a discrepancy. And what's in writing is usually true. So when an employee is up against you going, but the handbook says this, or you're saying this, but in writing it says that, we want to make sure to correct those things, okay? Not to contradict. Your handbook shouldn't contradict your knowledge and what you know. So your handbook should be able to answer all of these questions. So this is why these important statements should be in there. Employer or employer can change the terms and conditions of employment without advance notice or cause. That clause should be in there. That at-will statement should be in there in the handbook, because things like, that's not in my job description, or I don't, you have to give me this much notice or time before you terminate me. All those things won't matter if you have this at-will statement that's saying we can change the terms, and they can too. So they can leave after 2 days. But we also have a 2-week notice policy that we would like you to follow. And maybe your handbook does state that, and so we can redirect them to that policy. Not subject to change except in writing, signed by the employee and expressly designated company representative. That's again part of that at-will statement, where it's saying this handbook is not subject to change unless it's in writing, signed by the employee and an expressly designated company representative. That designated company representative should be a very high level executive. We're talking CEO should really be the only one. President should be the only one that's changing that at-will disclaimer in your handbook. And then include an integration clause that supersedes prior agreement. So that last one, we want to say something like this handbook supersedes any prior handbook that was done, so that the current handbook is the one that lives, because we might have handbooks from 10 years ago floating around. We want to say this most current one from 2024, 2025 is going to be the law of the land. We want to make sure we address harassment and discrimination and remind employees that the decisions that we make are objective and they're performance-based. They're not based on discrimination or harassment. So you want the company to make a statement that we are a harassment and discrimination-free workplace. And that is a requirement. California requires you to have a policy that's going to make that statement, and that's going to direct employees on where to complain if there's such an issue. So make employment decisions based on work-related factors such as work performance, attendance, safety, or violation of policy. And so we want to have this again, your policy in your handbook, and so that employees are not misconstrued that they're being terminated for harassment reasons, but rather for performance-based or attendance-based, or there's a violation of policy. We want to make sure you know all the protected classes. They do need to be listed out, and I'll show them to you in the next slide. That is a requirement for your policy to include the protected classes. So there's quite a bit of California protected classes. They're reviewed when you do your harassment prevention training every other year. That's a requirement. So you don't need to know them all in specific detail, but they do need to be listed out, and you should have a general idea of all these protected classes, because we don't want to inadvertently discriminate someone for these reasons. And it's easy to do. It can be easy to do. So if you're dealing with a performance issue with an employee, maybe you fail to document those issues, and suddenly someone tells you they have a medical condition and need to go out on leave of absence, and you're ready to terminate them for performance. We need to make sure that we're aware that these medical condition protected classes exist, that medical condition is one of them, so that we take a step back and review whether or not there's risk involved in terminating this employee because I failed to document all their performance issues. So we might need to take a step back and see, is this going to be the right termination right now? Should we maybe instead document that performance issue, knowing that there's a protected class that we need to consider before terminating the employee. So these are the California protected classes. Most recent off-duty cannabis use, before that reproductive health choice. These are all new. Make sure that you have these. The Fair Employment Housing Act is the one that includes all these protected classes, and that your policy and your handbook includes them. So here is what the Fair Employment Housing Act says your policy needs to have. It needs to have a statement that harassment is illegal and will not be tolerated. Again, it's going to list those protected categories. It's going to have laws, prohibition of coworkers and third parties, as well as supervisors engaging in that conduct. So your policy is going to include that. An anti-retaliation statement, meaning employees can report these things to management without fear of retaliation. It's going to include the Civil Rights Department and the EEOC contact information and their training links. That's also a requirement that should be in your policy that's going to be included in your handbook. And then it's going to list out a detailed complaint process of everything. It's in bullet points here. So you can see that it's going to tell the employee the process of when they file a complaint, what's going to happen. Make sure you also know what you should be doing, because your policy is stating this. When there's a complaint of harassment or discrimination, you're following this. Okay. If 10% or more of your employees speak a language other than English, you do have to have this policy translated in your handbook. So make sure you do that. All right, let's skip over to the area now. The next section you're going to include in your handbook is leave of absence. It is not always required, but it is a good idea to list this out. So, well, let's review paid sick leave, because there was a change to paid sick leave this year. Not next year, thankfully, but it is part of the Healthy Workplace, Healthy Families Act still. That's been around for quite a while, but it does provide now 5 days of sick leave or 40 hours of paid time off for job protection for your own health illness or that of your family member. Excuse me a second. My apologies, I'm getting over a cold here. So we want to make sure that your sick leave policy addresses which policy and sick do you follow. Are you going to be doing the lump sum or the accrual? So the accrual is 1 hour for every 30, and you cap it at 80. You can limit the use of 40 in a year, or you can do the lump sum method where you just grant them the 5 days or 40 hours each year, and they expire at the end of the year, so there's no rollover with the lump sum. In any case, whether you do accrual or lump sum with the paid sick leave, you can require employees to wait 90 days to use paid sick leave. So they're accruing as of day one, but or they have it as of day one, but you can have a waiting period of 90 days. It can be 30, it can be 60, but make sure your policy in your handbook actually says what it is, because if it doesn't say 90 days, they're going to be able to use it as soon as it's accrued or as soon as it's earned. So make sure you make that distinction in your policy in your handbook. Remember, sick leave is not paid out at termination. You want to include that disclaimer in your handbook. And then you want to also include a notice that says employers cannot retaliate for using sick leave. Remember, we cannot question the use of sick leave anytime. So we want to make sure that employees know that, and the way and the labor commissioner wants us to include that in our policy, that we're not going to retaliate in any way for them using it. We want to just put a note here on PTO, or combined paid time off, where you put your vacation and your sick leave into the same bank. That's not a problem. You can do that so long as you're meeting the 40 hours requirement. But just know that if you do combine those two, then now the entire PTO bank is subject to the paid sick leave ordinance, meaning now you can't question when they take it. You have to pay it out at termination, and it's the same conditions as if it was a sick leave policy, other than you have to pay it out. So sometimes it's discouraged to combine the two, but it's whatever works for your company best. Just know the rule and make sure that you're writing a compliant policy in your handbook for that. And beware of local sick leave ordinances. We reviewed the California one, but there's many, many, many ordinances out there, local ordinances that are different. They have both a higher sick leave and a higher minimum wage. So there is a link here where you can click on, and you can actually go to that link, and we'll list out all the cities and counties that require additional time that are beyond the 5 days. So be aware of that, because if you have remote employees working, if you have employees working in separate cities, then you want to make sure you're aware. It's wherever the employee is working is where the law applies. Okay, let's move on to the next leave of absence that I want to cover for you is pregnancy disability leave. This is important. We do need to notify employees of PDL, so a handbook is a great place to put this policy in. Just a little overview of who's covered. Employers that have more than 5 employees are subject to the pregnancy disability leave. Eligible employees anytime a healthcare provider states that an employee cannot perform one or more of the essential functions of their job without undue risk of themselves or their pregnancy's successful completion. So PDL is something that employees are going to be eligible for as of day one for employees, again, employers who have 5 or more employees. Pregnancy disability leave can occur before, during, or after the actual birth of a child. So it's not just when they're disabled because of a child, but it could be before. It could be because of morning sickness. It could be because of medical appointments that they're having to go to because maybe they're at high risk. So it could be at any time in the pregnancy process. How much time do they get? They get up to 4 months, or the equivalent of that in days and weeks. Amount of leave is per pregnancy, not per year. So if they have a pregnancy in January, and unfortunately maybe the pregnancy ends, then they have another pregnancy towards the end of the year, they would be eligible again. Leave can be used all at once or intermittently, so increments of 1 or more hours. So again, for those medical appointments, if maybe it's a high-risk pregnancy and they're having to go 2-3 times a week, they can use this leave for that intermittently. Can require, or employee may choose to use sick leave. So this is the one time we can require the use of sick leave for pregnancy disability leave, and the employee can always choose to do that. And it cannot require the use of vacation or PTO, but the employee can choose to use that as well, but we can't require it. This is, again, one of the few times where pregnancy disability leave is going to dictate what we force on PTO and when we force sick leave. And then the time needed must be certified. So I know sometimes we're being nice, and we know they're pregnant and we know they're having a tough time, and so we allow the time, but then that time sometimes gets abused. So we always want to make sure we're being consistent in asking for a medical certification from a healthcare provider, so that we know that is legitimate absence for that. Let me take a look again. I just see a question here. I have a question regarding on-call pay for non-salary employees. If employer asks regular hourly employees to be on call, are they entitled to special on-call pay even though they do not work but are on call? Let me answer that when I get to that wage and hour area. If you want to pin me to remind me, that'd be great. But let me continue on with leave of absence section. But thank you for your question. I will address it then. The next one I want to make sure that you get into your mindset in your handbook is the CFRA, the California Family Rights Act. We want to make sure that that's in your handbook. If you're an employer that is an eligible employer, you have to provide 12 weeks of unpaid leave for employees, for work for employers with 5 or more employees. Uh, so you're going to be eligible, I'm sorry, if you work for an employer with 5 or more employees and work 12 months out of and 1,250 hours in that 12 months. So you always have to look at the employee requesting it to see if they're eligible for that. The covered reasons for CFRA are very similar to FMLA, but also different. It's going to include the birth of a child, adoption or foster care, employee's own serious health condition, care for a family member that's defined there that have a serious health condition. And they've added also this designated person that has a serious health condition. You can take it for that, or the exigency for active duty for armed forces as well. So these are the reasons for CFRA. PDL is different. The pregnancy disability is not going to be included on here. So as you can see, that is different from FMLA because pregnancy is included under pregnancy disability leave, not California Family Rights Act. Baby bonding, CFRA. The actual pregnancy while pregnant is under PDL in California. So FMLA, include this in your handbook if you're a large employer with 50 or more. Again, you can look at the details here. You're going to list out those reasons on your policy for FMLA as well. And then again, you're going to look at whether you're an eligible employee or not. So take a look at that. You want to include this in your handbook because we need to notify employees of how we're treating that FMLA look back for 12 months. Are we looking at a fixed 12-month where we look backwards? Are we looking at a 12-month calendar year and looking at whether or not they're eligible then? Are we looking at a fiscal year, possibly July to June? I'm sorry, I apologize, my voice here. There are more protected leaves that you can also include in your handbook. I've listed them all out here. Some may or may not apply. It depends on your employee size. We actually do have a free, if you go to employers.org, or maybe Anna can find it, we have a fact sheet that's called Employment Laws and the Employers They Affect. So it'll tell you how many, what the head count is and whether or not these laws apply. If they do apply to you, then I'm going to encourage you to include that in your handbook if you're at large. And most of these are probably going to be for most employees that you're going to have to include all these. And we do have a leave of absence webinar that's an hour long that we discuss in detail all these leaves. But for the purposes of this one, this is just a handbook. I'm going to tell you include them if you're an eligible employer. So let's get over to wage and hour because there has been some wage and hour reform when it comes to PAGA. PAGA is the Private Attorney General's Act, and there's a new law that, well, first of all, PAGA is when you get hit with the PAGA, and many of you may be familiar with this. They're typically like class action lawsuits where it comes to wage and hour, where one employee will say, this affected me, and they can then represent and take the entire workforce and say it affected them as well. So plaintiffs' attorneys use these laws, these labor code violations to bring in claims against employers, and they are very high in penalties. So we've seen these PAGA actions started to rise in 2004, and they've just skyrocketed. And it really leaves employers with these huge burden in trying to defend these wage and hour claims. So there's been some PAGA reform, and if you take our labor law update, you'll hear more detail about it. I wanted to mention it today because there is new opportunities for employers to reduce their penalties by demonstrating they took reasonable steps to comply with wage and hour laws. So there's new opportunities to cure these PAGA notices when you're hit with them. And so we're going to recommend that you periodically do payroll audits and that you have your written policies when it comes to in your handbook that covers wage and hour so that employees know how they're getting paid correctly. And this is again one layer of protection for the employer to say we're doing our part. We're taking reasonable steps to correct these things by informing employees to take their breaks, to ensure they're doing their time cards, and we also employer are auditing our own time records to make sure that we are in line with what we're supposed to be paying, and we're doing it in good faith. And that goes a long way with this new law that's coming into play right now. Okay, thank you, Anna. She listed out some resources there for you. So I wanted to mention that PAGA reform because it's going to be essential for you to have really good, well-written wage and hour policies right now. It's going to be a good defense for you should you get hit with the PAGA claim in the future. So one thing you can do is you're going to minimum wage definition. So you're going to define your work day and the work week. That makes a difference, everybody. So a work day is any consecutive 24-hour period beginning at the same time each calendar day. Depending on the operations of your business, it may make sense for you to say, we start at 7 a.m. and our work day for purposes of payroll goes through 6:59 a.m. Or it may be that you like the traditional 12 to midnight to 11:59 p.m., which is the default. But again, depending on how you pay employees and how overtime is calculated in California, 8 hours over 8 hours in one day, how you define your workday may matter, again, for your business, for your industry. Same thing with the work week. It's any 7 consecutive days starting with the same calendar day each week. So some businesses say, I like to start our work week Monday and end it on Sunday because it just makes sense. Or some employers say Wednesday to Wednesday. So it just depends again on your business. The default will be Sunday to Saturday is the default in California. And so when we're trying to figure out, again, this matters for overtime purposes. It matters for when we're working 7 consecutive days in a row. We're looking to see how is that work week defined in that business. Remember, daily overtime is time and a half for anything over 8 hours in a day, over 40 in a work week, and then the first 8 hours on the 7th workday in a work week. That's why it's going to matter how we define that work week. And then 2 times the regular pay. And this is all included in your handbook so that there's no misunderstanding by the employees saying, we didn't know. And the employer is saying, we know we have to pay time and a half. We have a policy on it. And so we have all these things listed on our handbook. Breaks and meal periods are also defined in your handbook. You're going to, these are still very costly mistakes that employers make. And so having the disclaimer that we give out, that we have a meal and break policy and what it is, it's going to just defend again, good defense claim against an employee attack when they say they didn't know they had to take their break or they didn't know they had to take their meal period. So remember, this is for hourly employees, and we want to make sure we train our managers to strictly follow this policy. We may have this in place, but if our managers are not actually out there and ensuring there's coverage for employees to take breaks or encouraging them to go and break for lunch, then it's not going to work. So we want to make sure we train our management on that as well. So you're going to list out the rest breaks. Remember, rest breaks are an employer is to authorize and permit an employee to take a 10-minute net rest time for every 4 hours worked. And then a rest period is to be in the middle of a work period. It shouldn't be where we put them together at the end of the period to leave early. Can't do that. Or to make our lunch larger or longer. Can't do that. It really is, according to the law, needs to be in the middle of a work period. Rest periods need not be recorded on time cards, on time records. You can record those just for purposes of tracking, but that's not an obligation to do that, not required. You cannot require employees to remain on the premises. I'm hoping most employers aren't doing that anymore. It used to be where we would say it's a 10-minute break, you can't leave, but if they can make it to Starbucks and pick up their order and bring it back within 10 minutes, you have to allow it. Failure to provide that rest break is 1 hour of penalty pay. So if you do fail, maybe you guys are really busy some days and so you didn't let them rest. They couldn't take their break. They missed that first one and they just went straight to lunch. Then the penalty is 1 hour at regular rate of pay. So you have to pay them 1 hour of penalty pay, and you're going to put that in there as a separate line item saying that it is a penalty pay for missing that break. This is that graph there, that little table shows you how many hours worked and what the rest periods are. So make sure you take note of that, and that's also in your handbook. The same thing for meal periods, that we're permitting a minimum of 30 minutes for anybody who works more than 5 hours in a day. Remember, your meal period has to start before the end of the 5th hour. So we always say at the 4 hours and 59-minute mark is the latest clock out that employee can have. You do need to relieve your employees of all job duties. So failure to provide that, or failure to provide it on time, or failure to provide the entire break because maybe we asked them to come back, is a 1 hour penalty pay similar to that break. So if you missed everything in a day, maybe they were traveling and couldn't stop, and so they didn't take their first break, they didn't take their second break, and they didn't take their meal period, the maximum that you owe them is 2 hours. That's what the law says. 1 hour for the break, even though you missed two, you're only going to pay the 1 hour penalty for the break, and then 1 hour for their meal period. So two max. So you're going to list out here, you see how many hours worked and what the meal breakup is. Make sure that there are some waivers as well that we can do. Have those waivers on file, and make sure your waiver for meal periods state that it can be revoked at any time. So employee or employer can revoke that meal waiver. We have to have that on there. And list on there as well, if you do the meal, make sure that we're doing it correctly. If the employee works no more than 6 hours for that meal waiver, we cannot waive any meal period if they work more than 6 hours. Even if the employee wants to, that meal waiver is not going to work. So I think I see some questions here, and I remember I had that wage and hour one. Okay, let me take a look. Does the 1 hour penalty pay for missing a break or lunch need to be recorded on a time card or on the pay stub? Yes, it does. And it does need to be, so we can't, it's 1 hour regular rate of pay for that penalty. We can't just pay them an extra hour. It actually has to be a separate line item that says penalty pay, or it says something, lunch, missed lunch. It needs to address the fact that it's an extra hour paid at the regular rate of pay on that pay stub. It doesn't have to be recorded on the time card, but it does need to show as a separate line item on a pay stub. So thank you for that. And then the other question, I have a question along the lines of handbook versus policy manual. Especially with LOAs, there is a lot of detail. How much should it be in the handbook versus what should be reserved for the policy manual? So remember, we recommend that handbook be the one that has details regarding your policies. So it can be detailed, and with leave of absence, I would be detailed because we want to make sure we're answering questions about eligibility, what they can use the leave of absence for, how do they become eligible, how are they paid or not paid, are we forcing payment during a leave of absence, or are we not? So all those things should be addressed in a leave of absence policy that's in the handbook. Most everything, so you as the employer can reference that handbook and you'll know how to answer all those questions because your handbook's going to have that detail. And then I remember there was a wage and hour question that I forgot now. Okay, on-call pay for non-salary, so hourly employees. If employer asks regular hourly employees to be on call, no, I missed it. To be on call, are they entitled to special on-call pay even though they do not work but are on call? Okay, so on-call pay, yes. And so hourly employees, if we are controlling the time that they need to be available, and this is something you probably should call into the hotline for because it can get a little complicated. We'd ask you a lot of questions about that control time. So if we're asking, remember that Tilly's case where employees were being asked to call in at a certain time to see if they would work, then on-call pay is required because we're controlling that time. If we tell the employee, you may be called in to do a job, and we need you to be available during these 4 hours, should there be a call, and that employee can't go to the movies, they can't go to a Dodger game, they can't do anything because that time is controlled, we should be paying that on-call pay. But if we're saying, hey, look, we're going to call you, if you happen to be at the movies, that's okay, we'll go to the next person, no on-call pay is required at that point. So it depends on the circumstances, depends on the agreement. We actually have agreements, or if you're a member, you can log in and we actually have an on-call agreement. So that you can have that signature and there's a clear understanding of how that will work and function. How long does the break have to be in California? They have to be 10 minutes. So I'll put up that net, has to be a net rest time of 10 minutes, meaning The 10 net, meaning it has to be where they're actually resting for 10 minutes. If you have a security line that you have to go through in order for employees to leave the area to rest, you have to account for that. So sometimes employers will do 15 minutes to account for that 2.5 minute maybe travel time to where they need to get to. That's not you, then it's just the net 10 minutes. So just again, every employer is going to be a little bit different. Okay, let's keep going here. So here's some tips for meal and rest break area here. Remember, employees can leave the premises for both breaks or lunches. They can leave the premises. We don't have a policy that says they have to stay because that's out of compliance. Employee must be at workstation promptly at end of break. So you can say that. Employees must notify supervisor or document any missed breaks and reasons why. So have that when they're confirming or attesting to their time card being correct, you're asking that question. Did you take all your breaks the way you were supposed to? And that gives the employee the opportunity to say, no, I didn't. I missed it because there was no coverage and I couldn't leave. And so then we pay them that penalty pay then. Rounding reminder, we're not rounding meal periods. Remember, we cannot round meal periods at all. They have to take a full 30 minutes at least. If they take more, that's fine, but it has to be at least 30 minutes. So we cannot round into the time clock. Rounding should actually not be done at the beginning, at the end of the shift either. That's something that's very fastly changing right now. There's a lot of case law that says we shouldn't be rounding entrances or exits either. So don't round the 15 minutes or the 8 minutes. We have technology now that actually allows us to track by the minute, and that's what the Labor Commissioner is seeing, and that's what the Labor Commissioner wants to see is actual time. Okay, let's move on to workplace benefits and expectations here. Talking about vacation, conduct, do's and don'ts, profit sharing. So out of the wage and hour law, but if you have questions, please keep them coming. I actually just saw that there's okay, those were answered already. Terrific, good. Okay, let's move on to the area of vacation, which I've talked a little bit about already, but we want to be careful about our vacation policies. This is an area we see that's done incorrectly a lot when we do audits. So we want to make sure your handbook has a correct policy. Remember, vacation are considered wages in California. So we do need to earn our vacation daily in California. So if you have a policy that says after 1 year you get 40 hours, you really are accruing that 40 hours from a certain date, and that should be on your vacation policy. So if you say on your anniversary year you get 40 hours, you actually have been accruing that 40 hours so that when you get to the anniversary year, you have 40 hours. And that's how California views it. And so you need to be specific about when did they start earning that, from day one, from 90 days, how much are they accruing per pay period, because California will do it for you if you didn't do it. And so you want to define. Some employers will say you start accruing after 90 days, and that's fine. You can start accruing vacation after 90 days. But if you leave the company after 100 days, you have to pay out whatever they earned from 90 days to 100 days, because they probably had a 10-day period of earning an increment of vacation. Because again, vacation is considered wages and it's considered where we are accruing it daily. You can set a reasonable cap to vacation. So you can say you can cap at the recommended is a time and a half. So if you have a policy that says you accrue 40 hours, you can cap it at 60 hours, or you can do double, 80 hours. It should be at the minimum 1.5 times. So a reasonable cap is considered 1.5 times. Consistency is key. Be consistent on how you do vacation. We're not just giving this vacation policy to this employee and that employee has a different vacation policy. That's why it's written in our handbook. We cannot have a use it or lose it policy in California. You can't say if you don't use your vacation by the end of the year, you lose it. That was an old policy. Make sure your handbook doesn't say that, because it's not allowed. It's not in compliance. You do have to pay it out upon termination. So again, if you say employees get vacation at 1 year anniversary and they leave before the 1 year, you do owe them vacation, at least some increments of vacation, because even though they couldn't use it, they have it accrued. Personal days and floating holidays in California are treated as vacation, the same way vacation is. So if you have a floating holiday, It's got to be paid out upon termination if it hasn't been used. Same thing with personal days. So many times we tell employers probably best not to have a personal day or a floating holiday unless you're going to remember to pay it out, or roll it over, because you can't have a use it or lose it either for that. Or better yet, just increase your vacation policy and do away with the personal day and the floating holiday as well. Can you require your employee, I'm going to questions here really quick. Can you require your employees to remain on the premises during their meal period if the employer compensates the employees for their meal period? Yes, you can. If you're paying them for that meal period, you can control that. That's the way kind of around that. Yes. And can a manager automatically apply PTO hours to an employee even though the employee does not request the hours? So force them to use the PTO, not if you have combined sick leave with it. You cannot use so you can force the use of vacation. So you can say, our company is going to be closed on the week of July 4th. You can say that, and you have to use your vacation. And as long as you're giving them reasonable notice of that, you can do that. But you can't do it if it's a PTO policy that combines sick leave, because again, we can't ever tell employees when to use their sick leave. And so if you combine that with your PTO policy, then that kind of hurts you, harms you, which is why we like to separate sick and vacation out, because now you're forced to use those sick leave ordinances on your PTO. Good questions. Okay, so a word about drug-free workplace policies. We really want to encourage you to have one, even if you do not drug test upon hire. It's okay. You want to have a reasonable suspicion policy in your handbook, because we've seen things that go, you don't think it's going to happen until it happens, and then you realize, oh my goodness, I don't have a policy on this. What do I do? So it is recommended to have a drug-free workplace policy for all employers. You're required to inform your employers before you can test them, so for reasonable suspicion. So if you have an employee suddenly report to work and they look like they're intoxicated, they look like they're under the influence, you want to make sure that you have a policy that can test them. And this is the policy that's going to be in your handbook allowing that. There's no law precludes disciplinary action against employees under the influence of drugs or alcohol at work. So, yes, we have a cannabis right, but that right doesn't give us the right to be under the influence of cannabis at work. So you can still have a policy against that at work as well. There are substance abuse, but not on the job use protections in the labor code for that. So have a reasonable suspicion policy, and then know which clinic you're going to send your employees to should this happen. So again, just a quick word on cannabis use rights. This is a new federal the Fair Employment Housing Act protected class. So we do need to include it in our handbooks as a protected class, meaning you can't discriminate or take adverse action against an employee for using it while recreationally. Okay, but it does not permit an employee to possess or be impaired while on the job, and we want to make that statement in our handbooks too. And remember, federal contracts, that this law does not apply to them. Let's see. Question here. Let's go back to reasonable suspicion here. In a case of reasonable suspicion, if an employee is tested, however, the employer does not receive the results until 2 days later, is the employer required to compensate the employee for that time missed, regardless of the results? This is where your policy is going to be very important. So your policy is going to address that. If we're going to do reasonable suspicion testing on you, employee, you're going to be out until we get the results of that test. So your policy should address that. That is unpaid until we get the results. And if your policy doesn't address it, then you have the case of what should we do? What's the best thing? What's the best practice? Maybe you do pay them because you don't have a policy stating that. Did they work or not? If I'm reasonably suspicion testing an employee, I'm going to have them out until I have the results. So, and my policy is going to state that there is no payment until we get that results. So that's a really good question. And again, CEA, we have our whole detailed policy. So if you're a member, reach out, we can send that to you. Or if, again, you all get a discount for the handbook template, which our handbook template has all these policies already written for you. Some suggested discipline guidelines here. When it comes to discipline, you want to avoid that lockstep disciplinary process that says we're going to give you a verbal warning, and then we're going to give you a written warning, and then we're going to suspend you, and then we're going to give you a final warning, then we're going to terminate you. You can list that, but you can say that we are not following that on all cases basis. It's a guideline and rather than progressive steps, right? We don't always do that because if the violation of policy is serious enough, we have the right to skip those steps and go straight to termination. Reiterate that the employment is at will and that disciplinary action does not alter the at will status. That's another important thing to include. Some suggested language is violation of any company policy, either written or otherwise, may result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. That way, again, it's a guideline. It's allowing the employer to decide at the time of the event how we're going to proceed with this employee. It's going to be on a case-by-case basis. You also want to include integrity policies. These are all very important. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a reminder of important integrity policies that should be included. Again, you get the CEA template. We have that all in our handbooks, and they all have a purpose for them. They really define what the restrictions of an employee's are, and then also the expectations when it comes to all of these. It defines and forces the employer to define what our policy is on these things, especially things like no solicitation. That's important to keep unions out, out of our break rooms, so that we're controlling the narrative of how our company operates. All right, a few more policy suggestions, company social media accounts. And again, if you're writing some of these policies and you're not sure if that's compliant, that's what the hotline's for. Give us a call and say, can I read you my policy real quick? What do you think? Is this going to be okay? Mobile phone device use, breaks, meal periods, after hours, company vehicles, gas cards, all these things you want to address. And again, be very clear in the handbook of how this is going to function. Company property, personal vehicle use. Do they use their own vehicles? Do we pay for mileage when, well, we have to pay for mileage when they're using their own personal vehicle for work purposes other than their own regular commute. So all those things are going to be defined. The Stericycle decision kind of changed things for employers. It's kind of a challenging workplace rule that says that it is unlawful if we try to chill employees from exercising their rights to discuss wages and other terms and conditions of employment. It used to be where we had policies that said, you have to be quiet, our integrity policies really quieted employees from talking about wages and employment conditions. Well, we can't do that anymore. So this really places scrutiny on workplace rules. Make sure that you don't have super antiquated policies that say they can't talk to each other, because we can't do that. Do not include in an employee handbook any probationary periods. I know they're very popular out there, but that kind of takes away from the at-will statement. When we're saying that you have a probationary period and you have time to, you have 90 days, but we already know after 7 days that you're an awful employee, we want to terminate you, they can say, well, I have a probationary period. You're supposed to give me 90 days. No, we don't, because we have an at-will disclaimer. So don't contradict. The probation period sometimes contradicts the at-will statement. Don't have those lockstep disciplinary process. Make sure that we can skip steps at any time. Policies are subject to frequent change. You want to say that in your policy too. So any kind of policy that implies job security. We're going to monitor your work over the next 30 days. Make sure that you say unless something happens that allows us to terminate you sooner. And make sure you train your supervisors and managers in all this as well. So last things here as we wrap up, consider an employee action hotline, because it really does reduce liability for employers when you have something like this. It allows employers to be able to call out and to call out to the employees and say, I have a problem or a concern. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Some handbook reminders here. Make sure that you do it right. Again, you get that 10% discount with the hotline. I encourage you to use our template, or if you have your own template, just check your policies and make sure that you have all those things that are compliant and that you're changing anything that might be changing for 2025 on there as well. Things like the Workplace Violence Prevention Plan, which is new, the Injury Illness Prevention Plan, and the COVID-19 plan should not be in your handbook. They should be separate from your handbook because those change often, and they do tend to be a work in progress that we need to get employee feedback on. So we don't want to include that in the handbook. We're right at the hour, so I just want to remind you about the Workforce Development's hotline. Give us a call. I know there were some questions that I didn't get to. Please call us and we will answer those questions. Somebody's already on the phones right now and to be able to answer. And we love hearing from you. We have our training codes here, and I'm going to actually send it back to Anna. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me today. I appreciate your time and patience with my coughing as well. Thank you so much.
Astrid, you did an amazing job, and thank you for rolling with the punches here with managing your health. So I appreciate your time and your energy. But yeah, your HRCI codes and SHRM codes today, if you are joining us for continuing education credits, HRCI code 686445. SHRM code is 24-R9XKH. You see ceainfo@employers.org, or you can notate that general phone number or just call your HR hotline if you have any trouble redeeming those codes or don't really know how to apply them towards continuing education credits. We will be more than happy to help you. Let's see, I see one more little template. I'm going to grab that link for you real quick. In the meantime, if you want to, Astrid, advance to the next one, I believe that should be our survey slide while I find that link to the handbook. Of course, my Wi-Fi is.
Yeah, I believe it's 349 for non-members. If you're a member, it's 249. But
Yes.
don't quote me. I believe that price hasn't changed. But yeah, Anna will find the link and it'll get you there. And just so you know, so our handbook template has all these policies we went through in a California compliant, and actually you're going to be getting the 2025 handbook, which is all updated for 2025 because there were a few updates to certain laws, and if you want to know more about that, please visit our labor law update for that. Yes, thank you.
Sure. So yes, I did just drop the link into the chat with the link to that DIY handbook available in our store. If you are a CEA member, you do get a member discount there. So really encourage you to check out that resource. And then if you scroll up a little in the chat, I did drop a link to our HR forums page also. So lots available for both members and non-members. So really encourage you to bookmark that page and utilize those resources. As you see on the screen, there is a link or a QR code, excuse me, to our survey. Again, it takes less than a minute to complete. It's only 5 questions. Most of them are multiple choice, but you have another option here. Once you click out of Zoom, a browser window will pop up. All you have to do is opt in. So if you could take a minute to share your feedback with us at the end, that would be very appreciated. And Rebecca did drop her contact info into the chat as well, but please also reference in your PDF handouts. There will be the information about connecting with Ventura County about for more employer resources. So with that, I want to thank you, Astrid, for sharing your time and energy today. I hope you get well soon. Rebecca, Cynthia, your entire team over at Ventura County, thank you again for sponsoring trainings like today. And Rebecca, do you have anything else to share with the group today?
No, the contact information is below, and if anyone has any specific questions regarding employer services, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
All right, so with that, we want to say thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the training. And as far as the recording, so since Ventura did sponsor today, we send the recording file directly to them. Once that recording is available for playback, they will reach out to you all and let you know how to access that recording. So stay tuned in your email, and we look forward to seeing you on another training soon. Thank you all. Enjoy.